Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining us for the second webinar in our new Resilience Matters webinar series. My name's Lauren Richardson. I'm the Executive Director at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I'm super excited and delighted to be your host for this session. Reason why I said good morning is because I'm actually hosting this from Egypt, a land with significant knowledge and wisdom. So I wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you will join from today, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be participating in this event. Uh, I want to pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the 65,000 years that I think the original systems thinkers, the Indigenous people, have been sort of living with natural hazards, and certainly think that there's much that we can learn from that sort of accumulated wisdom as we face sort of increasingly complex challenges. So before we get on to the important stuff, I just want to kind of run through a few housekeeping measures. Today's event's going to be recorded and will be made available along with the slides after the event, and that'll come out through our updates from AIDR. So make sure you're subscribed to that if you haven't already. We're going to use the Q&A feature on Zoom to take questions, so please post them in there and not in the chat window, because we don't monitor that as much. Whereas if it goes in the Q&A, then we can make sure that we can either focus on it or combine it with some other questions, but we'll be able to see it. You'll be able to upvote the questions. So if there's one that takes your fancy, or you'd really like the panelists to answer, then just click on the up, and I'll do my best to get a number of these to our speakers. But we do encourage you to use the chat window to share any thoughts or reflections during the presentations, and that's something that we find is really great. If you do that, just a reminder that you'll need to select everyone in the drop-down menu, so that'll actually come up in the chat. Also, if you are engaging in vigorous conversation, just want to remind everyone to be sort of respectful to each other and the presenters, of course, when posting your comments. And please be aware that sometimes some of the content that we discuss can be distressing or bring up prior experiences. So in that instance, please use any of the techniques you might have to help you kind of manage any sort of stress or adverse reactions. So with that, the housekeeping out of the way, let's get on to it. The Resilience Matters webinar series focuses on systems, environments, and human factors that intersect to influence the various levels of risk, harm, and equity that people experience before, during, and after a disaster. Interesting, I've been in Europe for the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, and a workshop introducing a new systemic risk assessment tool. So this sort of webinar is timely. The Sendai framework highlights that a linear approach to managing risk is no longer adequate, given the way a lot of our systems have become so interconnected, and the pace of our lives has sped up. So what many people are calling a polycrisis or polycrises, we're seeing disasters occurring in sort of quick succession, overlaid in a cost of living crisis, the effects of COVID, rising geopolitical instability, and other stressors. These all have an impact on how we sort of prepare, respond, and recover. And this is one of the reasons why we developed the Australia's Riskape report, which gives you, working in this sort of in the sector, an understanding of these other sort of contexts. 4 years ago, we released a systemic risk handbook, and it was actually the first of its kind globally. And that's, I guess, what's prompted our interest in systemic risk and our understanding of systemic risk. And this was to support the development of the National Disaster Risk Reduction framework at the time, which again took a systemic thinking approach. So this webinar is really, I guess, a follow-on from that, even though it's a few years after, and we did hold a showcase at the time. But this is part of our sort of webinar series to help people understand the kind of issues around disaster risk reduction. And so this one's going to help us start to think systemically about the interconnected and cascading nature of disaster risk. So I'm going to get out of the way now because you're not here to listen to me. You're here to listen to Professor Lauren Rickards, who is the director of the Trobe Climate Change Adaptation Lab. And I'm really excited to be hosting Lauren, a big fan of Lauren's work for a number of years now. So she released a paper a few years ago on the impact of climate change and emergency services with Adriana Keating. And I think it was certainly one of the first papers where I really started to think, wow, this is we're really thinking about this quite differently. So I think she's one of the country's finest thinkers when it comes to systems. So I'm going to hand it over to you to talk to us about systemic disaster risk, Lauren.
Thanks so much, John. You silly pumped up my tyres there. Can I start by saying I'm coming from unceded Wurundjeri country and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge all the traditional owners across this continent who, of course, have led the way in systemic thinking of various sorts over millennia. We have so much to learn. The point about having a lot to learn, I think, is something I really want to preface this whole presentation with, which is to say that, one of the take-home messages here is that we all need to share our different perspectives and all need to put our minds to understanding what systemic risks are and sense-making our particular context at a given point in time. And there's absolutely no silver bullet. There's no one way of doing it. We have to just keep working together and experimenting to try to understand this incredibly complex situation that we're in. So what John's asked me to do is to do a bit of a kind of 101 on that. And I hope I haven't kind of overly dumbed it down. What I'm trying to do is to be quite systematic, which is just sort of working through this idea of systemic disaster risk and thinking about it from different angles and hopefully introducing one or two kind of aspects of it that perhaps aren't always evident in some of the more practical work. I should also acknowledge that I'm really just the warm-up act for Neville Ellis, who's going to be speaking after me about what this means in practice, and we'll be able to answer all of your really difficult questions. So I'll hand those to Neville. So yeah, you can see here what I'm doing is going through slightly different ways of thinking about this. So the kind of notion of systemic disasters per se, then thinking about a systemic character to disaster risk, thinking about this slight difference between our systems at risk and our systems as risk, and then finishing briefly with some just sort of, I guess, cautions about systems thinking and just a brief touch on implications, noting that, of course, there's a huge body of work on that, none the least of which is the AIDR systems, Systemic Disaster Risk Handbook. So next slide, please. So to kick off, when we think about systemic disaster risk, we think of it primarily in the terms of having a systemic disaster, something that is of the scale, the scope, often the speed, to really take us by surprise. We're talking here about enormous emergent events, and this reflects the fact that we're thinking here with decades of thinking that's come through a sort of complexity science lens of really understanding systems as these complex interactions that have these unpredictable outcomes. And so part of the point here is to think through all of the different ways in which aspects of the world, including ourselves, are connected. So there's a heavy emphasis on things like connections, interconnections, flows, circulations, linkages, interlinkages, dependencies, interdependencies, etc. It's very much relational thinking. It's very much about relationships between things. And that leads to this focus on sequences of things over time, which often is discussed in terms of cascading impacts. And so among the many, many, many pieces of work that have been written on this topic, which I'll just bring you a few today, there's this real focus on trying to better understand the interactions between us and the systemic nature of those. The image there is, as you can see, from the tsunami in 2011, which was a system interconnected event, which of course was triggered by an earthquake and led to a nuclear catastrophe, which then led to a further flows through the ocean, this time of radiation. And that's sort of NARTEC event, as it's called, a combination of natural and technical hazards, is very much symptomatic of what's considered to be systemic disaster risk. Next slide, please. The other one that obviously comes to mind here is in the recent past, maybe some of us have blocked it from our minds, though I think I've still got a drawer of masks at home, which is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the reasons that was, of course, so deeply consequential at multiple levels was the ways in which it was characterised by huge connections in many, many different types of systems. So this analysis by UNDRR, so United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction, really emphasizes the globally networked nature of risks. So that's that networked aspect of it, the cascading effects, not just of the virus itself, which soon became dwarfed by some of the responses, some of the official responses, some of the unofficial responses, things like trade route disruptions, of course. The ways in which it was very unequally experienced at the same time as being pervasive. And that's a real characteristic of systemic disaster risks, is this kind of tension or paradoxes. A lot of discussion of paradoxes in understanding systemic risks. One of the paradoxes is, of course, they are very widespread. They are characterized by this system-wide effect, but the effects are very unevenly felt as well. And then we have things like the compounding nature of COVID-19 plus other non-natural hazards. And what this did was really change our notion of risk. I think part of the drama of the situation was just the rapid intellectual recalibration that had to go on by decision makers and even those of us who were just simply trying to work out how to get by in these very evolving, rapidly evolving situations. And I speak as a Melburnian who obviously had a record number of lockdowns. Next slide, please. So COVID-19 was, obviously a pandemic. It's, considered to be a health disaster, a health catastrophe. But one of the things about it was that it, of course, was very cross-sectoral. It covered many, many different sectors. In fact, left none untouched. One of the sectors that was touched is one that is very familiar with systemic risks and it actually has its own lineage of discussing systemic risks quite separate from the complex adaptive systems literature. So over in the financial space, systemic risks have been discussed for quite a while. You can see there a quote from 1990 when people are talking about the fact that, if one group of institutions fails to do its role within the financial system, then the effects will very quickly cascade and compound. And that's, of course, what did happen with the so-called global financial crisis around 2008 and other ones as well, European, Russian, other financial crises. And that sense of kind of being entwined in this rather mysterious but highly precarious financial system has really added to the focus on this nature of systemic risk and systemic disasters. Next slide, please. More broadly, and perhaps what most of us here are more familiar with, we've become more and more aware that, first of all, this planet that we're on functions very much like a system, but perhaps not like the system we used to know, the Holocene system. It's shifted into what, is a controversial point, but I'll argue is an Anthropocene system, so like a different operating system. So the Earth itself is characterized by a whole range of subsystems, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the cryosphere, etc. But the way that they're acting, the way that they're interacting is changing. And one of the most dramatic examples and drivers of that is, of course, anthropogenic climate change. And so we come here to a topic that Patrick Keyes and colleagues calls Anthropocene risks. So these are the many, many risks that are arising out of these changes in the key functions of the Earth system that are perpetuating through not just the Earth system, but of course the social ecological systems and really are very, very complex cross-scale interactions, including temporal ones. So trying to sort of understand how do you deal with things like, for example, an acute non-natural hazard, a disaster, let's say a fire, which of course is the big Australian systemic risk in our minds, Black Summer fires, how to think about that, but at the same time think about these broader shifts that are happening. For example, sea level rise is, a really, really complex challenge we face. And it's the fact that, all of these things are circulating. So we saw the smoke from the Black Summer fires, for example, landing on the glaciers in New Zealand, reducing their albedo, accelerating the melting of that ice as well. All of these interconnections are ones that we've sort of known about theoretically, but are becoming much more apparent, much more real. And just the sea level rise one in and of itself is such a massively complex systemic risk. There's nothing non-systemic about it. It's absolutely connected through, of course, the poles, through, of course, the sea itself. And you can see there NOAA's statistics on the degree of, this is billions of metric tons of ice lost per year since 2002 on the right there, leading to the rising of sea combined with other factors such as temperature. But then that in itself is leading to all sorts of responses, including, of course, in some cases, managed retreat, which has these flow-on effects spatially. So it's the ways in which these things are causing these cascades of effects that is really something that we're having to deal with when we're thinking about systemic disaster risk. Next slide, please. And so part of what we're coming to grips with is the different characteristics of complex risk, which is a very related term. There's a whole family of terms here that is often discussed in terms of systemic disasters. So one is putting the R propeller into the classic even Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC risk model. So Simpson et al. Here add that in. Sorry, that should have a caption, Simpson et al. 2021. So putting the R in to realise that it's the responses that people are taking that is also adding to or reducing risk. The interactions between each of those categories, then you get different ways in which different types of risks are interacting. So the aggregation of them, sometimes up to the systemic level, the compounding of them, which is around the intensity of them in any one situation, and that cascading effect, that causation of other consequences. And strictly speaking, cascading is when the next consequence is actually larger than the previous one. So you get an amplification effect. So all of this means that we're trying to sort of think in multiple directions at once. At the same time, we're also realizing that things like these nice elegant figures, of course, are useful, and I certainly use them myself a lot, but they are also deeply inadequate. There's just simply not enough space on a page to actually connect all of the different things. One thing we need to realize is, of course, when you're thinking about the hazard, that you need to think beyond the immediate local hazards in that sort of first generation type climate change adaptation space of thinking about what climatic changes are going to occur here in my local area, but we'll get to that down the track. Okay, next slide, please. And when we think about this, this has become a massive challenge for groups such as AIDR, who's leading the way, but also other international groups. So IPCC is really pushing to try to think more systemically on these sorts of things. So here's a brief example of how it's trying to do that. So it's thinking here, and it's talking about numbers of risks. So here it's focused on the water and food one with that diagram, but trying to think through these feedbacks and think the ways in which it's individual risks. So it names, for example, representative key risks, the ways in which they're actually interconnected. What this means is that the sorts of lists that we're accustomed to, listing things, really needs to be complemented by a focus on the relationships between the items in any list, especially when it comes to listing key risks. And that's what the IPCC is trying to do. But it does, as you can see here, even in this stylized version, become very, very messy very quickly. Okay, next slide, please. So we've just been talking about the characteristics of systemic disaster risk, but what are some of the drivers? And when we think about the drivers of risk, so if you think back to that propeller and you recognize in particular the drivers of vulnerability, the drivers of exposure and response, you start to realize that what's actually causing these risks is in of itself systemic. Now, this is a fact that disaster scholars and practitioners have obviously known for decades, and there's a huge amount of literature on it. But once again, we're sort of revisiting that and reading it with new eyes, if you like. First of all, there's the fact that when we're thinking about systemic risk, we have to think at different scales. We have to recognise that any system at any scale faces disaster risk, and that part of this is simply the fact that entropy occurs, that degradation occurs over time, disorder builds in systems, and anyone who's in charge of managing an aging infrastructural system will be very much aware of this, or perhaps an aging volunteer workforce will also be aware of this, which is not to say that human aging is only about degradation, and obviously it's about the building up of wisdom as well. But there is a degree to which we're recognising that there's an inherent characteristic of systemic disaster risk as well. Next slide, please. As I said, there's been a lot of focus on this, and I think the kind of mainstream disaster risk reduction community is probably really ahead of the game when it comes to thinking about this in terms of the broader risk community. Still, I think, underplays a lot of the role of vulnerabilities. So in this particular diagram here, another one from some of the kind of great international syntheses that have been going on, there's a big emphasis on different characteristics of vulnerability, socioeconomic, some of them are demographic and social characteristics, and lack of coping capacities is drawn out there particularly as well at the institutional level, infrastructural level. So when you start to see risk in this way, so you see that the drivers of risk are very much embedded, you start to realize just what a huge job it is to actually try to reduce those risks and the importance of thinking beyond just the hazards as well. Part of this too is to recognize the inequalities and recognize how close we are to disaster a lot of the time, in terms of a lot of people really kind of just getting by, if you like, that coping, that only just managing to make things work. And certainly that is a familiar feeling, I think, for a lot of people, but is particularly so for those experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage. Next slide, please. What we're also talking about here are characteristics of modern society, if you like. So these are points that have been highlighted again over decades, but in particular that focus on the very interconnected nature of our modern socio-technical systems. And so when we're thinking about all of the different ways in which we're connected, just think about all the stuff that's at work in our ability to just have this webinar right this moment. So many different things are working, so many different things are having to actually coordinate, that you realize there's a huge amount of risk just buried within that complexity. And a lot of the time, the connections that we're talking about are actually unrecognized until a disaster occurs. And so this is, as Boardman and Sauser put it, very much about systems taking it upon themselves to form their own connections. And you can see that in the technological space, you can see it in the organizational space. So much is happening. It's so hard to keep up. Just think about, the disaster management space. It's so hard to just kind of work out who's doing what and what's going on, et cetera, and yet we're meant to be thinking systemically. So there's something kind of inherent to the ways in which we all are constantly making new connections. And the networked nature of this means that when something happens, that you sort of have a kind of almost endless number of networks and connections to follow. So you have to make decisions about what you do and you don't look at. Next slide, please. At the same time, there's institutionalized barriers to what we do and don't look at, and they have blinded us to problems that are now, I think the technical phrase is biting us on the butt. So things that we have displaced, problems that we have pushed beyond particular responsibilities. So thinking here about environmental laws, for example, things that are not considered to be the responsibilities of different organisations, particularly in a capitalist economy. Then what you get then is a series of things that have been building up for a long time. So that might be, for example, problems with, say, worker health and safety in situations where the normal way of doing things has built in such a narrow buffer for failures, such a narrow buffer for variation, that things are much more precarious. Likewise, the systematic socialisation of costs and risks that has occurred means that we're getting huge wake-up calls. One such wake-up call, just to illustrate this, is of course things like pollution by microplastics. I could equally have mentioned PFAS or a whole range of other things where we have this seemingly inescapable exposure to these serious environmental pollutants that's been kind of baked into our systems and has not become highly visible, at least to the general public, until recently. And so that's what I mean by this kind of building in of low level, but nevertheless systemic, so widespread risks. Might not seem like disaster risks, but of course, it's only 1 or 2 steps away, and it obviously depends as well on perspective. So these are the sorts of things that we also need to consider when we're thinking about systemic disaster risk. Next slide, please. So the question of perspective is really, really important when we're thinking about systemic disasters. So what we take in our work is considered to be like a relational perspective on risk, where risk is actually a relationship between a perceived threat and something that is perceived to be of value. And so what we're talking about here is understanding that what we choose to see as risk, being at risk, so what systems are at risk, is, of course, a really loaded question. What risks do we recognise? What risks do we not recognise? Whose risks do we recognise? Whose risks do we not recognise? And this is part of critical systems thinking, is prompting us to think about these very power-laden questions about what's considered to be valued and vulnerable, as put here. And when we do that, next slide, please. We see that when we're talking about risk, we really have a great opportunity to actually step back and ask some big questions. And that's what systemic risk in particular prompts us to do. So as this really helpful DQ publication, which will be in the chat later, really lays out, one of the things that climate change risk reduction prompts us to ask is what's important to us as an organisation, what's important to us as any group or even as individuals. And that's what actually scopes your assessment. And so when we talk about values-based adaptation, or putting values at the front of things, this is not simply about putting kind of, I guess, classic virtues at the front of our thinking, or thinking about how to advance kind of different normative goals. That's clearly part of it. But part of it too is thinking about not just adding on values, but what values are already embedded in what we're doing now. So what are our goals and objectives, and why is that? What are we trying to do? Why are we working on a certain policy or program in the first place? And when you start to think like this, then you start to recognize that what is at risk is very much a product of the broader systems that we're part of. Next slide, please. And this is where we come back to one of the points I made at the very start about the really fundamental importance of sharing perspectives and understanding the limitations of our own perspective. This is really nicely highlighted in the Australian Government Climate Risk Management Notes about the need to recognise that different people see different aspects of risk and different types of risk, which is actually an application of a broader approach to risk that's also very much apparent over in the financial risk management space. As I indicated, that's been thinking about systemic risk explicitly for quite a while now. And so understanding that we need to actually spend time working out what our shared risks are, that they're not just self-evident, it's not just about sort of tracing the connections, but it's also about a values-based conversation about what are we trying to do here. That actually means that we can start to really get into what the systemic risks are. Next slide, please. And one of the things to note here is that one of the kind of related differences in perspective that's important to keep in mind here, certainly it's helpful for me and other academics working in this space, is that while we may be focused on the risk object, as it's called, the actual threats, for example, so I identify as working on climate change, and then a whole lot of stuff is at risk. Others are starting at the other end of the equation. They are focused on objects at risk, and then they're thinking about what poses a threat to that. And of course, when they do that, then they see a whole range of different risks and a whole range of different contextual factors that we can't see. And that's one of the reasons for some of the challenges. It's interesting too to think about the ways in which in the corporate world, climate change is being bundled up in the International Sustainability Standards Board, so the old TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and they use this particular typology here of transition risks and physical risks. If you see that box on the right there, that's their framing of what climate change looks like from the perspective of a corporation. Now, I could spend a very long time critiquing this, including the fact that there's not a lot of scope for understanding the flow-on effects of physical risks here. You've got acute, you've got chronic. Transition risks, which are the sort of policy changes primarily associated with greenhouse gas mitigation, get a much more complex treatment here, but the physical risks get a very poor treatment, in my opinion. But the point is just to sort of understand these different perspectives, starting from looking at from the world from the inside, looking out at the threats. This is part of understanding different perspectives on systemic risks. Sorry, I'll have to speed up. Okay, next slide, please. The other point to say is that some risks are just not recognised. They're not seen by those who are at risk. And I've just mentioned that in this particular webinar because I feel like, a lot of us work in a space where we're trying to convince people that they're at risk and they don't necessarily see that. And of course, then you come up against this challenge of like, well, maybe, from their perspective, they're not at risk. And there's a tension there between wanting to emphasize the reality of the threats that we see, while also respecting the fact that from their perspective, it's not necessarily a serious risk. But one of the values of tracing systemic risks, one of the values of actually really emphasizing how pervasive and serious these are, is that perhaps more and more people will recognize that they are in danger. They will recognize that the systems that they value are under threat. And so there's, I think, part of the interest in systemic risk is because of this frustration of having people that don't actually recognize the seriousness or the relevance of things such as climate change to their own daily operations. Next slide, please. And then, so we talked about our systems being at risk, but hopefully you can also now see, as I've kind of traced through this, that part of the problem here is that our systems themselves, some of our systems, particularly the human-created systems, are themselves a risk. So that's part of the kind of wake-up call as well. So realizing, oh my goodness, we're in this situation, we have created these systems, we are kind of embedded in these very complex, interconnected environments. And yet part of that is the problem to actually being able to reduce the systemic risks that we face. So the absolutely fundamental systemic risks that we can't avoid are the Earth system ones. The socio-technical system ones are the more optional ones, and it's those ones that are starting to really become apparent as a type of risk. And what we get here is this sort of flipping, and this is how cascading risks occur, is that something that is a threat then threatens an object at risk, but the way it then responds, so it might collapse. Let's say it causes a blackout in an electricity grid, for example, or it might be a social response on the broker floor of Wall Street, for example. There's a contagion among all of the brokers. That then creates a risk for others, which then creates another threat, et cetera, et cetera. And so you start to kind of unpack here the way the threat and the object at risk keep flipping, kind of like a domino. Next slide, please. And this is where we come back to some of those structural vulnerabilities, and without getting too political, I think it is just, I feel incumbent to point out that some of the systems that are creating risk for us are very much embedded. They're very much here, evident in the Australian context. Some of it is, I think, inherent to the financial system and the capitalist system, the way in which it grows and benefits from creative destruction. The ways in which we have systems such as our environmental legal systems, financial disclosure systems. I've already pointed out some of the inadequacies in the perspective that so many corporations are picking up when they use those very narrow physical risk categories. All of these things are creating risk for the rest of us. That's the point, creating risk for the rest of us. I won't point out what that picture is of, but you'll work it out. So we need to think critically about our systems. Next slide, please. So to just finish off, I just want to quickly point out that, of course, you know, the systems thinking and the systems thinking, like systems thinking is like any tool, relatively, you know, agnostic. It's how it's used that matters. And there's ways in which it can be quite unhelpful. So the first point is that it can just be done badly, and that is always very unhelpful, particularly if, you know, it has a lot of consequences when particular risks are kind of blocked out or scoped out. Any kind of scoping work is possibly the most powerful step in any risk assessment. A lot of it is self-centered, so it's focusing on the self and, you know, thinking about risks to me, and that's very much embedded in a lot of climate change adaptation stuff. How am I at risk? What will I do? Singular scale. So I've got a picture here of Murray-Darling Basin, you know, so obviously managing across that requires actually managing at different scales at once and being unreflexive. So what do I mean by that? So next slide. So, Werner Ulrich talks about the need to always be really reflexive about our boundary judgment. So how do we scope our system? What boundaries do we put on it? And that is a reflection of our values. What do we value? So that question of what do we consider to be at risk, which of course then changes or, you know, affects what we see. What facts do we see? What do we observe? We don't observe things that we don't value and things that we scope out of the picture. And so to end, I can see John there, last slide. There are many, many implications of this. And just to touch on just a handful of this, next slide, please, is we need to be very reflexive. We need to be very clear and open about our blind spots. So I'm a big fan of Johari's window. I'm sure many of you know that, about understanding what I see, what you see, what we both see, what we both don't see. Acknowledging, of course, inherent uncertainties. So that's a huge area of work, and that's where scenario planning, as John mentioned at the start, comes in, really, really important tool. And really building complexity into how we do things, including climate change adaptation. And, you know, it's worth noting that, you know, from 2007 there's been a big, big emphasis on understanding the complexity of adaptation type decisions. So I'll leave it there and we can hand over to Neville. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Lauren. Always going to be a really hard to fit something as complex and hard, you know, kind of crazy, really, as systemic risk into sort of half an hour or a bit more than that. And I guess that goes to the nature of what we're trying to grapple with. But thank you for that sort of short tour through some of the things that we are looking to try and grapple with. So now we are going to say, well, the so what? So we've heard all this, and Dr. Neville Ellis from DFES, someone we've been shooting the breeze about systemic risk across the Nullarbor for the last year. he does have the unenviable task now of saying, okay, so what does this actually mean for us in our daily jobs? Because this is something he's certainly grappling with for the Department of Fire and Emergency Services in Western Australia. So, Neville, really would be interested in your reflections on how to apply this.
Well, excellent. Thank you, John, for that warm introduction. And good morning from Western Australia here in Noongar Whadjuk Budja. My name is Dr. Neville Ellis, and I manage the Climate Adaptation Program on behalf of the Western Australian Emergency Management Sector. Can I start by thanking Professor Rickards for your excellent presentation? Also, thank you very much for throwing me under the bus at the beginning of your presentation. And can I recommend to our fabulous audience today that if you do have any very hard questions about systemic risk, that you pass them on to John Richardson. Lauren, I think I got us off the hook. Next slide, please. So from a state government perspective, I think it's fair to say that we're just starting to dip our toes into the very deep waters implied by systemic risk. Nonetheless, there is increasing pressure to do so. Some of that pressure is coming from what we're seeing in the literature. It's starting to filter down from international and national policy. But from the most part, it's coming from our real world experiences of having to deal with an increasingly complex disaster landscape. So the figure that you can see here shows the overlapping and concurrent nature of disaster risk we've been having to deal with here in Western Australia over the last 10 years. And no doubt for those of you in other jurisdictions, your maps would look very similar, if not a fair bit worse than this. So in the last 5 years, we've had to deal with an unprecedented cyclone impact, unprecedented flooding, unprecedented heat waves, bushfire seasons, unprecedented biosecurity threats. And just like all of you, we've had to do this in the context of an unprecedented global pandemic, rapid technological change, accelerating climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So what is to be done? So Mark Crosweller, the former Director General of the former Emergency Management Australia, stated over a decade ago now that traditional ways of thinking don't work when confronted by very complex, very large, catastrophic disasters. And as we've seen through Lauren's presentation today, similarly, systemic risk forces us to think different about what it means to govern risk. And for me personally, there are two areas where we need to urgently change our thinking. Next slide, please. The first is in relation to risk assessment. So for the most part, our sector continues to rely on conventional risk assessment methods, usually based on some sort of international standards such as ISO 31000. These are what we would call reductive methodologies. These are methodologies that seek to take complex problems and break them into their constituent parts. These approaches assume that risks are independent, that risks follow some sort of simple cause and effect relationship, and that likelihood and consequences can be reasonably estimated. Now, while these assumptions hold for routine risks at local levels, they do not hold for complex systemic risks. So, for example, imagine that I was being tasked with thinking through a plausible worst case scenario here in WA by which to test our emergency management arrangements. And I turned around to senior leadership in November 2019 and I said, okay, I've thought of a scenario. Imagine that we have a level 3 bushfire happening in the hills. We lose 100 homes. 2 months later, we have one of the worst tropical cyclones in our state's history. And we're going to manage all of this in the context of a global pandemic. I think I would have been walked out the front door and given a biscuit and told to sit down and reflect on what I just said, because it just doesn't sound real, does it? And yet that's precisely what we had to deal with. Systemic risks, therefore, are not singular things or temporary blips to be managed. Instead, they throw into question the resilience of the very systems that we operate within. And this means meeting systemic risks with systems-based methodologies. At the moment, there are no agreed upon approaches in Australia for how we do this, although we are starting to see some experimentation across the jurisdictions. Chances are we'll need many different types of approaches, and here there's a real opportunity to partner with academic institutions and others to figure this out. Next slide, please. The second major challenge confronting us is related to policy, and more specifically, the issue of problem definition. Now, historically, the policy goals of emergency management have been pretty easy to define because disasters have been easy to define. There's a fire over there, go put it out. There's people out there enduring flood risk, go evacuate them. A community's been hit by a cyclone, help them rebuild. Now, while it is essential that we continue to do this, it can't be our only focus. Last year's Insurance Council of Australia report states that the cost of weather-related disasters is now increasing at a pace that is outpacing economic growth, and modelling in last year's Colburn review projects a four-fold increase in the cost of disasters in just the next 35 years. Despite this, the vast majority of Commonwealth funding continues to be directed towards recovery and response, and this mirrors international trends. Given the increase in cost of disasters, this model is unsustainable. So we know we have to invest more in preparedness and resilience, but what does that mean in the context of systemic risk? Well, at a high level, it means shifting focus from investing in disaster management to investing in disaster management and systemic resilience. It means investing time and effort to understand the types of policies and resources and capabilities needed that will allow us to learn and anticipate, to adapt to change, and importantly, as Lauren stated in her presentation, address the root causes of vulnerability. And the timing for this thinking couldn't be more pertinent. Last year, we saw the release of two major reviews into our arrangements and our funding models, the Colburn and Glasser reviews. Both of these reviews call for the development of national level resilience objectives. Yet from where I sit, and this is just me observing this, there remains a tendency to want to define resilience in narrow terms. The central challenge confronting emergency management from my perspective then is to be able to step outside of its current logic, to think differently. As Mark Crosweller would say, the rules have changed, and our collective task is to figure out what those new rules are. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to John.
Thanks, Neville. As I said, I think I can see the bus coming my way now. We've got time for a couple of questions, hopefully. We're pretty close to the end, so perhaps we'll get one in. So we've got now three, and if we don't get to these, we will try and answer them offline and include this with the when we send things out. So just perhaps to Anna's question here, what factors influence implementation of risk management or systemic risk management with a systemic approach at a community or a subnational? I guess subnational is where you're at, Neville, but at a community level.
I think at a subnational level, at a jurisdictional level, it's actually an institutional challenge. The way we're structured over here in Western Australia, our institutional arrangements are hazard by hazard, and different organisations have different responsibilities for managing different specific hazards. There is no home in our institutional arrangements currently for addressing systemic risk. And of course, that then filters through to what we do in the community resilience and preparedness space. There's no home as such to be that to support our communities better for undertaking this work. I think there's certainly room for improvement here.
Yeah.
So it's a wicked problem.
Yeah, and I think potentially it's also, looking at, well, what elements can we even start to just apply, where we have the handbook and some of the guidance. So the Systemic Risk Handbook that AIDR produced also has a suite of decision-making guidance. It's again, it's a few years old now, but it was certainly first in the world. So probably, maybe Lauren, you might have a view on this, coming back to everyone thinking about what their context is and what they value and what they can apply.
Yeah, I mean, one of the kind of, I guess, obvious answers to Anna's question is the capacity question. And from a systems thinking point of view, capacity is, always better understood as capability, which is to say what's enabled, what are people enabled to do, which is that relationship between individuals and their environment. What I would say is that there's a lot of examples. We can kind of get very depressed by the state of affairs. Certainly, it's a daily struggle, right? But there are a lot of examples of people having creative responses to their situations and finding capability. And one of the things that's come out in some of our work with local governments is just how important individuals are. And I'm talking here like individuals, in local councils who have connections with individuals in other local councils or in other agencies, might have their contacts like in their phone, actually are on a kind of basis where they can pick up the phone and talk to them. These sorts of things, this sort of, it's like a kind of social version of professional capital or professional version of social capital or something, I think are hugely, hugely important, and sometimes get a little bit lost in some of the community social kind of conversations, where, sometimes councils are considered to work as a kind of monolith, but there's so much work that goes on at that individual practitioner level. I think that's actually a huge source of success for systems thinking.
Thanks, thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Neville. I think we've only got a couple more minutes, and there's some fantastic questions there. So we'll have to leave it because I want to get people, back to their day jobs. But what we will do is we'll have a look at the questions, and perhaps we can get together and so look at some answers to these, because there's some great questions in here. So yeah, again, thank you both for your time and reflections and fantastic presentations. I'd just like to quickly, a couple of shout outs before we end. Certainly want to thank our team here at AIDR, Angela Draper, Charlotte Fell and Simone Decker, who have been on their work for making this webinar possible, and also Caitlin Sampson, who's been, you haven't seen her, but she's waiting in the wings in case the link to Egypt broke. I'd also like to thank Emily Richardson for technical support here in Egypt, i.e. she bought a SIM card that allowed me to, this is my daughter, allowed me to actually do the streaming. Also want to acknowledge the financial support of the National Emergency Management Agency in bringing these important sort of concepts to the forefront. So on behalf of AIDR, thanks for joining us today. I hope you've got something out of this. And the third sort of webinar in this series will be on Wednesday, the 24th of July. We look forward to diving into the policy context, which will be excellent. Also like to launch a new webinar series, Spotlight series, which will be looking at showcasing emerging knowledge, practice and issues in the areas of disaster risk reduction. And the first of these will be disinformation in disasters, and that'll be on Wednesday, 25th of June. The registration link will come up in the chat. If you're coming to Perth, you can, for the Australian Disaster Resilience Conference, we will actually be running a workshop on systemic disaster risk. So Neville and I will be there, and we'll also come and talk to us. We actually have a poster outlining some of these issues. So the conversation will continue. This is certainly a really important topic for us to be grappling with. So yeah, there's sort of plenty of opportunities here to get involved. When you leave, you'll be asked to sort of complete a short survey. Please, please, if you have time to complete this, this is really helpful for us to sort of make sure that we meet your needs as we go on with this program. That's all we've got time for. It's certainly been my pleasure to host you this afternoon or morning, wherever you happen to be. And until next time, please stay well.